For people who are coming in, I want to make you aware of our group chat function and various links that our marketing manager, Emily Reynolds, has shared with us. You can sign up for our emails, follow us on Instagram, and I'll refer to the last link during my intro. I think there's a critical mass here, so I will get started. Well, first of all, my name is Liz Park. For those who don't know me, I'm the curator of exhibitions here at UB Art Galleries. And thank you, all of you, for being part of our event today and making possible our very first virtual program that we are offering as part of UB Art Galleries activities. I want to thank everybody on our staff who has supported this project, especially Emily, who is facilitating today's event. So I find that in virtual programs, it's even more critical to acknowledge what physical space we occupy and how this affects our digital interaction. So because we're embodied and embedded in the world that has many different realities. So I want to begin this program by acknowledging where I am, and that is the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and begin by honoring the sovereignty of the Mohawk Nation, Cayuga, Onondaga, Oneida, Seneca, and the Tuscarora Nations. And in this acknowledgement, I also sincerely hope that my public curatorial work as a curator and as a settler in Canada and as an immigrant in the US demonstrates my respect for the Indigenous nations. And today's program is really offered in the same spirit of acknowledging where and when we are. And that is, for me, present day Buffalo. And we have a new image of the city that is unfortunately circulating at light speed around the world, and that is of 75-year-old Martin Gugino, who was a peaceful protester in front of the city hall being pushed to the ground by a police officer in full riot gear. So it makes me question, what does it mean to picture this reality and what other realities are pictured here and elsewhere? So this conversation that I am having today, I'm so humbled and honored that we get this opportunity to have with artist and educator Sara Greenberger Rafferty. I want to have a few housekeeping notes before I launch into this program. This is being recorded for posterity. I want to make all of you aware of that. After my brief introductory remark, Sara will follow with her prompts and slides, which will be fodder for tonight's conversation. And then I'll jump back in as a conversant, and Emily will help facilitate the Q&A with the audience. Please use the chat function to add your thoughts to our conversation throughout the program. And we'll make sure to wrap it up before 6:30, because all of your time is very valuable and limited. So as a way of introducing this event, I want to chart the past few months leading up to this talk. Like many of you, the staff at UB Art Galleries has been working from home since March when the global pandemic was declared. And amid the continuing uncertainty, we have been talking and thinking about what it means to be an art organization. With our galleries closed until further notice and the summer exhibitions canceled, we took a stock of what we had been planning and what makes sense to prioritize. And one of the projects that I've been working on in the spring really came to surface as having the potential to reach our audiences virtually. And this project is called Thinking Through Photographs. And that is the third link that you see that Emily has shared in the group chat. Download the resource binder. You can click on that to find out what Thinking Through Photographs is all about. So Thinking Through Photographs initially was conceptualized as an exhibition of questions and thinking tools, which would have taken the form of wall text, books, and other resources installed throughout the second floor gallery of our Anderson location. And because we were planning photo-heavy programming this year at UB Anderson Gallery, I wanted to do a discursive project that really dug into photography as an artistic medium in 2020. How do we think about photographs as both images and objects today? And of course, I knew that this was a rich topic that many artists, scholars, and educators have delved very deeply into. And I reached out to one of them who I know at the beginning of this project, and that's Sara here, our distinguished speaker today. Also, I was aware last fall, Sara, along with her fellow artist and educator, Shannon Ebner, organized an illuminating and very thought-provoking symposium that was titled Teaching Photographs at Pratt Institute, where they both teach in the photo program. Their symposium centered around 3 questions. How do photographs teach? How do photographs perform? How are photographs made? And I was struck by the questions as powerful provocations that give agency to the photographs themselves. So we're talking about photographs teaching, photographs performing. And I was inspired by this very inquisitive spirit and thought that questions themselves can be thinking tools. And by asking why, how, for what, and for whom photographs, we can start to kind of cultivate a critical thinking practice and a creative practice. So thinking through photographs was born this way and took the very basic premise that there will be a cluster of questions around 8 topics that explore an aspect of photography today. And 3 of these topics borrow directly from Sara and Shannon's symposium and the 3 questions that I outlined. So I started working on this project, and immediately I needed to enlist some people to help me along. So in addition to reaching out to Sara and Shannon, who so generously shared their research and their reading list and the recordings of the symposium proceedings, I worked with a great designer, Chris Lee, who was formerly a professor at UB and now professor at Pratt, as well as graduate assistant Hope Mora, who's an artist and photographer who just finished her MFA at UB this spring. Congratulations, Hope. But it is Chris who I turned to when it became apparent that we will no longer have summer exhibitions and needed to transform the content initially conceptualized as an exhibition into something that can be available online. And he made an incredible downloadable PDF resource that you can take a look at. And it is Hope who read through countless articles, book chapters, listened to all the symposium recordings, prepared and annotated the bibliography and the keywords, all of these things that you see in the resource binder. So this project could not have happened without the 2 of them, so I want to thank them. Please check out the PDF. It really is a beautiful digital artifact. So we had intended to put this out there in the world as a free resource for all the students, teachers, and enthusiasts of photography as a free downloadable resource, with classrooms going virtual under COVID lockdown and more content becoming mediated through photo and video. We hope that the questions that we are asking can be a constellation that you use as a wayfinder, as a navigation tool. We were about to send this out as an announcement through our newsletter at the beginning of July. It was being planned to be pushed out as part of our newsletter announcement. And then Memorial Day weekend came, and the world witnessed the horrific murder of George Floyd, a Black man in Minneapolis, by Derek Chauvin, who was at the time a police officer with a known history of using excessive force and violence on people of color. After this video circulated fast and furious on the internet through various social media platforms, people took to the streets. We all saw the demonstrations happening, again, on screen or in reality and out there in person among them. Not only protesting George Floyd's death, but so many Black lives that were brutally ended by cops and white supremacists. So we took a pause, like many of you did, reflecting on what we are truly saying when we say thinking through photographs. What are our responsibilities as thinking human beings, and as arts workers, as image makers, image brokers, image circulators, image readers. That's all of us joining this conversation today. So this is also when Sara proposed, because I've been bugging her to do a talk as part of this project. This is also when Sara proposed to us that she'd like to have this conversation about qualities of representation during protest movements, and about metadata and how that information of when and where you take the photo is embedded in your phone, how to potentially obfuscate that data or erase it before sharing it on social media platforms or online. Along with blurring faces, erasing metadata is a way to protect the identity of the protesters so that they do not become targets of retribution. And I was very excited to hear Sara's idea for this conversation. And again, so grateful for this opportunity to share it with all of you. And Sara really is a very generous and giving artist and educator. And rather than giving a standard introduction by reading her artist bio, which you can do anyways on your own time on our event page, I will just say that Sara is a very astute cultural and image consumer. She has an incredible ability to take in information and data, zero in on the images that speak to her, and transform them into provocative and beautiful works of art. Her impressive visual vocabulary includes everything from banal stock images to pop culture artifacts to historic paintings. And I think of Sara as a very engaged reader, looker, watcher, and I also imagine Sara in the past few weeks, like the rest of us, stuck at home, glued to a screen of one kind or another, watching, looking, and processing the world outside, questioning what it means to make a photograph now. What is this impulse that we have to document the protests, violence, racialized encounters? How do we picture the different realities that coexist in this world? It's a great pleasure to welcome Sara, and the only regret I will say is that this isn't in person.
Thank you so much for that most generous and beautiful introduction, for the care that you, the whole team, put together for the PDF, which is amazing. And it's really cool what happens when there's a sense of sharing and multiplying and dealing with momentum in a way that is generative rather than sort of possessive. And I think that's something that we see in the social justice movements that are happening right now. And that gives me hope for the future, and it gives me hope for a different world, a world that's not rooted in, principally concepts of ownership and that kind of thing. So I want to start by saying that I'm not an expert on this topic. As Liz said, I just thought, well, let's talk about this. If we're going to do something so soon, let's make it something that we're a little bit uncomfortable about, that we're feeling around for. And yeah, so I've prepared this evening about 10 or 15 slides. I've included some images of my work, but other artists as well, and some documents. And then I hope that we will have a conversation, which will happen if you guys want to chime in and talk or type things in the chat. Also, I think that there's always these two things, talking about the ways in which photography subjugates, and also the ways in which, like, we wouldn't necessarily even be in this moment if it weren't for the photo documentation of this most horrific murder. And I recognize that there's a really, really long history of photographing and documenting these types of terroristic murders. And right now is a moment where it's changing. It's becoming a tool of the people to change the system, rather than be a tool of terrorization and white supremacy. So that's obviously goes without saying for me, but I'm interested in sort of teasing out what all this kind of means. And it's as organized as possible. Let's put it that way. Okay, I need to just share my screen. Somehow I lost my screen share now. Okay, here we go.
I think it's already sharing, Sarah.
Okay, you can see now?
Yes.
Very good. Okay, so going to start with a few images of mine, if it will go. So this is a piece from 2008. It was in my show called Testing, and it's called The Law. And it is a piece of glass that has an image from the FBI file surveilling Abby Hoffman, who is the famous Yippie. And it's basically a semi-verbatim transcript that a spy, that an embedded agent said about something he said, which he said, Hoffman said it was illegal for him to wear an American flag shirt, but not for a person like Phyllis Diller. The law is illegal for some, but not for others. He stressed the inequality of United States law and criticized his recent trial in Chicago, Illinois, et cetera, et cetera. This is, from the 60s, and it's from a period of work where I used some FOIA requested documents and books as image. This is another piece where I was screwing the books to a table, and here's just a quick list of sort of the idea of information and data becoming image. I'm also really interested, and I think it has to do with like Instagram and the way in which all of the images are being collectivized. I'm interested in the fact that in the 20th century, sort of social photographs were about a single unique image. And right now, I think there's a real mode of, in 21st century, that there's like the aggregate. And I think that has to do with the metadata and the data, and also the fact of circulation and recirculation, copying, et cetera. It sort of comes at a time when I think I probably have more screenshots on my phone than I have photographs that I've taken. This is another piece from that installation, which was called Gloves Off Reader. And it's a wallpaper that's made with all of these FBI files from different comedians. And on the right is part of the file on Richard Pryor. And you'll see that they're reporting on some goings on in the Black Panther Party, and how there's an editorial in this magazine that says, "Black men, Black people, colored persons of America, revolt everywhere, arm yourselves. The only culture worth keeping is revolutionary culture. Change, freedom everywhere, dynamite, Black power, use the gun, kill the pigs everywhere." And this is from 1968. And basically just thinking about the ways in which the state was embedded in protest movements, especially in 1968, and the ways in which it might be now via data trolling on social media, et cetera, et cetera. This is a clip from a video that's 18 minutes long. It is purposely too much information. It can't possibly be digested at once. So just to tell you a little bit of what's happening, this is an image of the comedian costume for Rodney Dangerfield, but it may remind you of someone else who wears a red tie and an oversized stuffed shirt. There's a scrolling on the left of some of the same FBI files. At some point, there's cell phone video of a white woman in a Chicago Michaels making a rant, and someone photographing her and she's photographing them, videotaping. And then towards the end of the clip, there's looking through jokes on the student protests of the 60s. So this is about a 2-minute clip.
In one's immediate actual circumstances. It is now a given that a limitless availability of information or images can trump or override any human-scale communication or exploration of ideas. According to the Tickle Collective, we have become the innocuous, pliable inhabitants of global urban societies. .7 Even in the absence of any direct compulsion, we choose to do what we are told to do. We allow the management of our bodies, our ideas, our entertainment, and all our imaginary needs to be externally imposed. We buy products that have been recommended to us through the monitoring of our electronic lives, and then we voluntarily leave feedback for others about what we have purchased. We are the compliant subject who submits to all manner of biometric and surveillance intrusion, and who ingests toxic food and water and lives near nuclear reactors without complaint. The absolute abdication of responsibility for living is indicated by the titles of the many best-selling guides that tell us, with a grim fatality, the 1,000 movies to see before we die, the 100 tourist destinations to visit before we die, the 500 books to read before we die. I often play Jet Set, a game for airports on my phone while waiting in line at airport screening zones. In this way, playing security theater while security theater is actually in play. Jet Set is a video game where players take on the role of a TSA agent ushering passengers through the screening process at security checkpoints. Players are charged with confiscating a changing array of prohibited items, from toothpaste to rocks to sippy cups to t-shirts with Arabic text. Designed by Persuasive Games, Jet Set's players must screen passengers for prohibited items by touching the item on the phone's touch screen to, for example, remove a traveler's pants, depending upon whether pants are prohibited or allowed. Players must be efficient in clearing the lines of travelers, or a backlog will.
So I should also mention that the text, the audio part is from this book, Dark Matters on the Surveillance of Blackness by Simone Brown, which is, I think, a really excellent and very timely text. And so in that clip, there's sort of the question of, you know, how do we contend with the overload of images and information? And we have all of this information that we can, as people and citizens have access to, becomes overwhelming, but it also becomes a kind of data for us, but also for the state. So this is some work by an artist named Sadie Barnett, and her father was a Black Panther activist, and this is some work that she did with his FBI file, and the project was called Dear 1968. And so she's excerpted these parts from the file that basically years later, once her family got a hold of it, helped her understand this shadow experience of her father. And this is a pencil drawing called Dear 1968, Love 1984, which is when she was born. And you can see that she says, the text rendered on the negative space of much labored over graphite mark making. The salutation is to the year 1968, which resounds internationally as an iconic year of political turbulence. The affectionate valediction is from 1984, both the year I was born and a year synonymous with, in the US, with the generation of hip hop, Reagan era policing, and the crack cocaine epidemic. I would add to that the sort of dawn of the personal Apple kind of computer and the GUI interface. Reagan era policing, crack and cocaine. This piece is a love letter to 1968, an apology perhaps to the generation who sacrificed. While the missive reveals no text, it holds space for what is impossible to state and for what exists beyond language. It seeks advice, it wants answers, but knows there's no easy one. Utilizing these practices, I create a historical tapestry through which I reclaim the material from the framework of repressive forces intent on dismantling dissent and offer the testimony of my family tree as American history. And that's from Sadie Barnett's website. And now a short, I think one of the most prescient artworks that's been made about this issue is this Hito Sterile, How Not to Be Seen, a fucking didactic educational move file. And this is a small clip from that.
Lesson 3. There are 7 ways of becoming a picture. To camouflage, to conceal, to cloak, to mask, to be painted, to disguise, to mimicry, to key. Around 2000, a new standard for resolution targets is introduced. This is a pixel-based resolution chart. It serves to shoot pixels. In 1996, photographic resolution in the area is about 12 meters per pixel. Today it is 1 foot. To become invisible, one has to become smaller or equal to 1 pixel.
Okay, and then another short video clip. This is from a piece that was at the Queen's Museum by American artists. And actually, earlier in the summer, I am trying to wrap, like I'm sure a lot of you are, my brain around teaching and learning online. And so I had signed up for a course called Dark Matters, of course, as an homage to Simone Brown's book that is taught by American artists. And it's an online course that I'm sort of in the middle of. So thinking a lot about these same issues, both coincidentally and also, you know, perfectly grafted, imperfectly grafted over this moment. So this is a quick clip from, as you can see, My Blue Window, an immersive multimedia installation, which American artist furthers an exploration of anti-Blackness as it operates algorithmically within systems. The exhibition focuses on predictive policing technologies, artificial intelligence tools intended to help dispatch officers to high-risk crime zones before incidents are reported. My Blue Window highlights the collective bias that is encoded within such seemingly neutral or scientific tools, invoking the divide between the Blue and Black Lives Matter movements. Artist connects this phenomenon to the legacy of slavery as an ever-present condition of the racialized society in the US. So this is sort of like a video game type interface. Oh, it's very short. Okay, let me see if I can fix this. Classic cop rolling through the stop sign. I find that to be incredibly accurate. Okay, and then sort of almost finally, but finally for the artwork, in thinking about this idea of a sort of poetics or bearing witness or something that that has a quality of the representation of this moment. I brought some images of Shannon Ebner's, and I don't have the correct titles or years, but it's from the series Dead Democracy Letters, and this was sort of around the Bush era of sort of some real intense war, iniquity, protest, and I have always thought of these images as a kind of war photography. Obviously, this one says explicitly war, but I think because there's this association, let's say back to 1968, with the sort of black and white, the black and white image of history. And this is the kind of the last one from that series that I included in the show. And just to also, I don't know, bring up, let's say, the recent release of Spike Lee, Da 5 Bloods, which he interspersed documentary photographs and documentary film within the within his fictional account and fictional representation. And we're so glad to have those photographic documents, as difficult as they are. But it also just makes me think that not one thing is adequate, and there's just a lot of things to consider when thinking about how to make history or make representation. So then to sort of some of the more salient features of the now and of the just real difficulty. I'm not sure if anyone has seen this one, but it's sort of on the left is the first image as it appeared on this Eyewitness News website. Eyewitness News 7, ABC 7, it's in Chicago, took it upon themselves to blur the faces of these armed white, I mean, it says bystanders, but to do an Alexander Bell, I might say, terrorists in Indiana. And then there was some outcry and they de-blurred them and published it back. But there was no sort of, you had to know this to even, and to have screen captured the blur, because that history is totally erased if you go to Eyewitness News now. Also, this, which, this New York Post story where this woman was, the FBI got a warrant apparently to go into Etsy, the craft store, to find that shirt that she's wearing, and they arrested her subsequently via that. And then this was something that I, especially when we came up with the idea, I was really interested in, as I was seeing so many pictures online of protests and so many recognizable people, and just feeling really anxious about how that was going to be operated. I saw this artist, Everest Pipkin, wrote a code so that you can upload your image quickly on your phone interface and take all of the data out of it, and then blur any faces and then download it back and post it. And so I was really interested in that kind of jamming activity, and I still am. And I think that it's also, you can see like behind all this, this is me like testing a picture, and it's just like a really interesting proposition for how to de-image something, kind of on the Hito tip. And then, of course, I thought about Abu Ghraib, which are sort of, this is a picture I had to redact it, but this is before social media, and this is meant for private consumption as a sort of commemoration of the torture. But I think it prefaces social media in some way. And I think especially of my own implication as a white woman, when I see this woman, you know, basically embodying this soldier, and there's an image of a dead person on that gurney. And it's horrific and vile. And it's really sad that we have to see these images of death and murder to believe it. And anyway, so I'm left with a lot more questions than answers, but that's my sort of preface. And I hope that we can think about this together, and I hope that other people besides me would like to talk. And I hope that made some sort of parameter marking sense. So I see one question. What aspects of representation as it relates to photography is in question in the context of picturing realities?
Hi, Sarah. I'm also back on unmuted.
Okay, I'm gonna unshare my screen. Okay, good. Thanks for doing that.
So this is a great first question, Janine. Thank you so much for this question, because I also was thinking about this because I kept going back to the title of today's talk, which was given to me by Sarah, and the idea of picturing realities is, to me, has this ring of talking about truth. You know, when we say, let's have a real talk, or let's think about how this is like in reality, you know, in real life, the realness has this sort of agency over, like it kind of holds power in a way that I feel is very difficult to kind of tackle today on social media. There's the world that happens through the screen, and there's the world out there. And Sarah credits that title, Shannon, with that beautiful title. It's totally true. It's a really beautiful and poetic title that makes us think about what is reality, and it's also pluralized, picturing realities, because as Sarah said in talking about the law, her work, law does not apply evenly to everybody. Reality, there are multiple realities in this world, that we're all, living in different realities. So yeah, maybe I was sort of helping to elaborate this question a little to make more entry points for Sarah to hop in and for other people to hop into this conversation.
That's your cue, people.
Should I add one more prompt in there, maybe to get people? Oh, yeah.
Janine has their hand up, but is muted. Can you unmute?
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
So the reason I asked that question is because, of course, the age-old question as it relates to photography is always this: is it real? And so when we use it for social issues or to document everything, that question of what is real in and of a photograph as a representational item, you know, where is that? And so I'm curious, in the context of what you're talking about, how that fits in, like the questioning of the photograph as real when we're using it, you know, as a either documentary or as a form of protest, whatever the case may be, where we're trying to get at something real, but using a tool that is fraught with lie. So I'm just I don't have an answer. I'm just curious how that fits in your mind.
I mean, it's a profound tension. Real and truth and reality. I don't dare have the answer to that. Maybe someone else on the call does.
Sorry.
No. I mean, it's an important. I think it's part of what we're doing, trying to be real, trying to be true. I think probably over the last month, a lot of people realized that their truth and their reality was fake and wrong, you know? And so I don't think there's really an idea of fixed reality. At the same time, things can be, and Aura's saying, what could have been more real than the video of George Floyd? I mean, it's unfathomable. It's also unfathomable that that would have happened whether or not there was a camera there.
Sarah, what about information and data? Like what, because you talked about information and data, their aggregates, becoming image. And I think about, you know, all the artists you touched upon, and, you know, they, in various ways, and because I'm a curator, I think about where their practices diverge and converge. There's a lot of information that is embedded in their work, and how they present them, of course, are, you know, through all sorts of different visual media. But for them, I feel like when you are talking about how info and data becomes an image, there's the question of it becoming illegible, but legible in some ways, clarifying and unclarifying. You know, there's a different kind of mechanism of sort of focus and unfocus in all of their operations.
Yeah, I mean, not just to talk about the concept, I think a perfect example is like how many people on this Zoom in the past month have seen copious amounts of articles, reading lists, book recommendations, you know, collected resources, even in a way that thinking through photographs is itself a bibliographic project about pictures, and that, you know, it was to be the way that the exhibition was visual. And there's also the idea of, you know, and I'm not like an expert on any of the sort of like media studies about visuality and things like that, but just the way in which all of this information just is, in fact, there's no person on earth that's read all of those things that came at you in lists, but you've seen them, and you've, I think if you got them on Instagram or through a screen or even on a printed page, you're taking it in as an image object. And I think that's sort of my idea. I see many different views of reality. Yes, that's the aggregation and the sort of and then there's also, what do you think are the limits to be considered in showing the horrific? Hard to see and violate the personal space, but on the other hand, it can move people to action. Yeah, I mean, that's the conundrum. I certainly don't have the answer to that. But it makes me think of the way in which when a lot of these cell phone videos started surfacing of the police or vigilantes killing Black men and women, the answer was body cameras or body worn cameras. And, I think about RoboCop and the sort of like the way in which scanning and photography and the cop is supposed to be, in the movie RoboCop, the cop is supposed to have no problems doing anything that the state wants it to do, but there's like a little like murdered man inside of it, like this small ember that realizes the truth. But I feel like the body worn cameras, like that's the answer. That's not the answer. And they're totally fraught and they're never turned on.
Representation as a deterrent. That's an interesting concept. Ora, would you like to chime in and explain what you mean by that?
Am I unmuted?
Yes.
Very simple, really, that now these videos, the cell phone videos, policemen having to wear cameras, before the representation even happens, perhaps will prevent what is going to be depicted from happening. I mean, I think that's hope behind that. So it's a kind of funny, almost like a vacuum. We're talking about representation, but representation is actually perhaps stepping in to make the representation not happen.
Well,
Is that clear?
That's the goal of surveillance, and surveillance is, that's why I really recommend that Simone Brown book. Surveillance is racialized, like, to the nth degree, and it's clear, I think, like, that cops don't feel like that representation is a deterrent to me as a citizen. Maybe something will change, I don't know, but.
Yeah, I hope it makes something change.
I think with so many cases, the unevenness of a condition for all of us makes one thing a deterrent for some and not for others. Like the law is illegal for some, not for others. And I think when we're talking about qualities of representation, for whom, by whom, all of these questions really come down to power relations and who has the agency to experience a certain reality, and what, as image makers, what route do we take, what approach do we take? And Sara showed 5 very interesting examples of artists who are looking at representation as possibly a deterrent, but for some, representation as a way to get around a certain system of images. So I think that there are, a number of different examples that are out there in this excess of images, excess of representations, excess of photos. I see that there's another comment from Stephen. The metadata scrubbing reminds me of another essay by Hito Cyril, The Uncertainty of Documentarian, where Cyril asks, how can we reclaim documentary distance? Critical distance from the power structure historically enmeshed in power. I also want to point out the PDF that I assembled is not by no means exhaustive, but you know, if in the same spirit that Sarah was talking about how it should be about sharing and not being possessive, you know, the thing about the PDF that assembles all of these things, it reminds us of other things to go out there and look for. So it really is just a compass for you, so that you can go out there and look for other information. And we have another question from Yola. Do you want to jump in, Yola, and ask the question yourself?
Yes, hi. Well, now I'll have to read it. I wrote...
We can hear you.
Yes? Okay. What about the iterative quality of some of these images? Well, what you mentioned at the very beginning was interesting, and I was wondering if you could elaborate about how, if I understood correctly, that you were talking about how the photograph has the ability to terrorize, or these certain kinds of documentary images. And I'm thinking, of course, of the famous photograph of Emmett Till. And then you mentioned that you're seeing a kind of transition to the empowering photograph, and of course, you know, the galvanizing power of the video of George Floyd, which actually I have to confess I only saw as a screenshot, because I deliberately. You know, I'm sort of thinking about the images and trauma. Like, I deliberately didn't want to see it, to have that experience of watching it, even though I, you know, kind of got the power of it secondhand. But I was, you know, I was wondering, in that kind of iterative quality of some of these images repeating over and over. And the question, I know the New York Times Magazine has a piece this week about 1968 images, and then they morph. I don't know if you've seen it, they just posted it online, but they morph into Black Lives Matter images. And this was like exactly the same iconography of protest. And, you know, I don't know what the conclusion will be, but that question of how, you know, how is there a transition, and is that galvanizing quality and terrorizing quality, like, are they two sides of the same coin? Can you talk about how you see that?
I think that's a good point. I'm curious what you think, Yola, but but I think it's yeah, maybe the two sides of the same coin. I mean, I'm super conflicted, because you have to not, you don't want that image to exist, but you have to go to a world that doesn't exist for the image not to exist. And you don't want it not to exist because, you know, it feels like there's an abscess in the tooth and you need the x-ray to find it. And then you have to take care of it, and it's like a total bloody mess. And that's how it feels like you just had a tooth pain that you tried to suppress. And that's how I feel not looking at those kinds of things, or not knowing, or not being aware. And I think, you know, earlier in the spring, I did a short lecture for Pratt, like, feels like 1,000 years ago, but it was like in April. And I was really interested in quoting from Elaine Scarry, who talks about beauty and justice, and how if you're sensitive to injustices, you also have to be sensitive to everything else. You're just sensitive. And I think that there's something to that in terms of representation. I think there's also just ways that representation, like other aspects of power, when it's going in one direction, let's say it's surveillance from the state onto the people, that's oppressive. When it's going the other direction, or when it's illuminating something, then it's a little bit more liberatory. But it's not any less, and thinking about the George Floyd video, it's not any less disgusting, horrific, just profoundly, devastatingly sad. Like, I really don't, you don't want, I don't know, you don't want that to have to exist as an image, but all the conditions have to go away for that not to exist as an image. So I feel like totally like a jumble and confused. So I don't think I'm the one to answer that.
I feel like that's a question that we should all be contending with as participants in the system that, you know, we benefit from images. We make money off of, you know, talking about images, presenting images. So that is a profound dilemma that we all have to contend with and find our own truth. I see that Gwenessa also has a great question, and then Jill also wants to respond to that question. Maybe Jill, do you want to jump in if you have a question, if you want to respond to either Gwenessa's question or Yola's question? Jill,
Hi.
are you there? There you go.
Yes, I am. I guess I would like to respond to the kind of question of the video of George Floyd. And as a Black woman, I have to question what in particular, this is going to sound a little abrasive, but the murder of George Floyd and subsequent recording of the murder of George Floyd has not historically been, I guess it hasn't been an isolated event. So I guess my question is now what in particular about George Floyd's video that is awakening some sort of subconscious in America that subsequent videos of murder similarly or assault similarly have not. And I guess in there is when we get the quality of the image in the photo, because in my opinion, it wasn't just the image of the video, it was the sensory of kind of feeling the weight of the officer onto the body. It was the sound, it was the visceral sounds of George Floyd crying for his mother. It was all of those things coming together to create a perception of this event. And I think that in particular is why it made this image so powerful. Because I want to say historically speaking, we've seen repeatedly images like these in various forms, whether it be postcards from lynchings all the way up to, 8 minutes and 46 seconds of murder. So I would say it's more of an introspective question of what in particular of this image made it that it caught on. Because yes, imagery and materials and representation can be manipulated. But when you see kind of images like these, I wonder what in particular made this one kind of spread,
I think that's a really good question. And also, I don't think what you said sounded abrasive at all. I think you're speaking to the conditions. For me, I mean, this is just like, I'm not a sociologist, but it's probably because we have a dumpster fire of an administration, a global pandemic. People are dying in communities. It's really clear who's dying in communities because of the pandemic. There's a slowdown of cultural activities because of it. And so it was the most perfect, imperfect time for people to rail. But I think it could also be like I heard something today, I was listening to a podcast and someone used the analogy of like, if you're running a marathon, you know how many miles you have to go. But if you have like a jar and you're trying to open the jar, you don't know when it's going to pop. This isn't my analogy, but I heard it on a podcast today and I thought it was really apt. Like you're just working and working and working the lid of the jar and then it pops. And I think I really related to the way that was used as an analogy. But I think it doesn't, I mean, I don't know. Do you have an idea of why this one video like finally made the movement that, I mean, that should have been happening since, I mean, you brought up lynching postcards. Those were used to terrorize, and they were like commemorations. So it wasn't even the idea of bearing witness in the way that we think about it now.
You know, this is such a profound. Go ahead, Jill.
I think personally, in my opinion, like I'm an artist that kind of focuses on the kind of creation of the signal versus the sign. So I like to work a lot with semiotics. And what really struck me about this video was the number of like universally understood kind of images and actions that happen in the George Floyd video that kind of, I think within society, we kind of have this picture, this visual picture of the human body. And when we see, and especially we kind of have notions that are based upon stereotypes for the Black body in particular, especially Black men. And I think that the 8 minutes and 46 seconds that we saw George Floyd get murdered, I think that there was definitely some undercuts of what the stereotypical assumption of what kind of Black masculinity and the presentation of the Black body. It differences so much from what we're fed in media in representation about what Black men do when they're in danger. We saw George Floyd now resisting. We saw George Floyd on the ground. We saw George Floyd cry out for his mother. All of those things that are stereotypically against what are seen as Black men. And I think that definitely had an aspect as to why this one, this particular instance made it so big. In conjuncture to, this was just one of 1,000, and I truly mean thousands videos in the sea where we see Black bodies being mutilated and hurt. So, and I think once we kind of see all eyes happening on this one particular event, we realize that it's not so special after all. So I think that in conjunction with the fact that we are at home because of COVID, we do see COVID disproportionately harming Black people. And we see those numbers. We see how people in our community are treated as if their body and their visuality of themselves matter. So I think all of those factors adding it together is what really created like the tinderbox of just this all exploding. Because after you're fed different visuals of Black suffering for literally hundreds of years, one more video was kind of like essentially the straw that broke the camel's back, in my opinion.
You know, we are, you know, this terrible job of being a timekeeper is to remind everybody that it is 6:30. It's actually a little past 6:30, and I did start out saying it's not going to go past 6:30, but I am so enriched by this conversation that we are having, and there are so many more questions that I have now than when we began with, and I am really sad to have this conversation end, but I do respect that people have to be on their way. Sarah, I want to let everybody know that you are talking again at UB later in the fall through Zoom for the art department, which will be an opportunity for you to address your practice more specifically. And, you know, I also wonder, you know, if you have additional questions, you know, maybe please continue to stay in touch with us and send us your questions. And, you know, if in some way or another, I do want to get back to all of you and continue this. We are planning to do a reading group of some kind in the fall. The organization and the details of which all TBD. But I want to make sure that all of us participating in this conversation will, you know, we'll share with all of you what the details of that are, so that there is an opportunity to engage in this conversation, if not anything else. I want to see, Sarah, is there anything else that you want to say or add?
I just want to thank people for tuning in and participating. And I think that, you know, it's a really serious time to think about engaging in images and engaging in this society, which is just feels, you know, there's just a lot of, there's just a lot of trauma right now that is always there, but it feels extra right now. And so I just recognize the sort of like deep inadequacy of everything that that I was trying to sort of lay out. And I think it's just like an ongoing, lifelong, daily, for me, recalibration and thought, you know, learning, a lot of learning. I think I change what I think about this like on a minute by minute basis. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing that last reflection on the inadequacy of, you know, of even having a conversation like this, which was an attempt to make space. And, you know, there are obviously shortcomings to this. So thank you for being honest and generous about that, and for everyone to chime in. And yeah, this is definitely just one of many of our personal practice and activities, and the activities that will come of UB Art Galleries later in the fall. So please keep following the work of Sarah and the artists that she mentioned, Sadie Barnett, Hito Starl, American artist Shannon Ebner, and so many more. And what we do, and we hope to bring you more opportunities to share our thoughts, and, you know, share our time and space, all those good things. All right. Well, take care, everybody.